thank you very much to ACGR for the invitation to come and speak with all of you as well. As Tracy's flagged there, this is something we've been looking at for quite a few years now, something that we love to come and talk about whenever given the opportunity. A lot of the big questions around workforce preparation are tied up, of course, with HDR students and with how we can really build a pipeline of Indigenous researchers to be going on and working on the types of projects that communities have in mind, the types of futures that communities would like for themselves, as well as non-Indigenous researchers who can help to participate in those goals as well. So I'm coming in today from the Babagiyamba campus here in Townsville. So we're on Bindal country. Prof Nakata's in the room down the end. We thought we wouldn't double up on one screen for you. So what we're really wanting to do today, as Tracy said, this is coming off the back of a book chapter that we put together as part of the Open Press ebook published by JCU, but with researchers from all across the country, that really looks at supervision and how we build independent researchers. And in doing that chapter, we wanted to, and Tracy's kindly put that in the chat, in building that chapter, we really wanted to think about what's some really useful and practical advice for the everyday practice of working with research students, particularly with Indigenous research students and with Indigenous research topics. So today we're wanting to share a bit of our practice with you, some of the things we've been doing here at the IERC, but also hopefully hear from you as well about the types of questions you have. So we'll start off, there's, I suppose, three parts to this conversation today. We'll start off just by sharing a little bit around our process and what it is we're trying to achieve here at the IERC. We're going to move on then to a bit of a conversation between the three of us. So we've got some questions that we wanted to work through, and then opening it to the floor for a question and answer, if everybody's on board with that plan. And so I will set this up. Here we go. So we sit here at the Indigenous Education and Research Centre. I'm going to hand over in a second to my colleague, Professor Nakata, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Indigenous Education and Strategy. And I'm sure he can explain to you our motto of doing things better means doing things different. So if I could introduce fellow panel members, Prof Nakata, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Indigenous Education and Strategy, and Associate Professor Sana Nakata, who's our Head of Research. But I know here in the audience, we also have other friends. Thanks, Prof Cadet James, for coming in, and hopefully we can tag you in as well for some of the conversation if you'd like to. Prof Cadet James has led the work at James Cook University for many, many years before somehow she managed to wrangle herself a semi-retirement. But we keep pulling her back in for work. And I see some other colleagues there who I did my study with. Hi, Daniel. So it's nice to see familiar faces going off into different areas as well. Prof, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Dr. A. And good afternoon, everybody, and a special hello to Stephen Muki. I see, mate, you've lost some hair, mate. Hey? Listen, folks, good to be with you all this afternoon. And just to get things underway, just some contextual kind of elements here. And thought I'd start with setting the scene with some quotes. And the first one, this one here is from an influential scholar and educator of my time and probably Stephen's time. And it reads, "The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy." And for Stephen and I, who grew up in the 60s and 70s, the radical space has always been our most comfortable area. It's an important quote too, as it underscores the transformative power of education and the potential for supervision to create spaces where students can challenge norms, explore new ideas, and engage critically. The next one is from Paulo Freire, again from our vintage, reads, "Education must begin with the solution of the student-teacher contradiction by reconciling the poles of the contradiction so that both are simultaneously teachers and students." Its importance here today for our conversation highlights the give and take nature of supervision, where both student and supervisors engage in a process of learning from each other, reflecting an approach particularly useful for the difficult intersections between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, as well as the dynamic relationship between different knowledge systems. The next quote is one from Carl Rogers, and this goes back even further into our period of learning some time back. And it reads, "The only person who is educated in these processes is the one who has learned how to learn and change." And this is a crucial aspect to keep in mind as it reflects the essence of guiding students to develop autonomy in research, fostering the ability to learn, to adapt, and to critically engage with their subject matter. It also underscores the goal of supervision to empower students as independent thinkers. These are thinkers who can navigate the complexities of their fields on their own. And these are very important elements I'm hoping that will set the kind of tone for this afternoon's session.
Thank you, Prof. So with that in mind, and I love that bell hooks quote because it reminds me every time that we enter into those teaching engagements of all the potential growth that can come from an engagement between teachers and students, supervisors and students in a whole variety of settings. So we've been working for a couple of years now. It was, I think, 6 years ago, Prof Nakata came to me and said, we need a research program. We can do an honours program, but not convinced about an honours. Let's start looking at MPhil and PhD. And so we're one of the very few Indigenous centres in the country who actually can enrol our own students. So quite often in different universities, Indigenous centres enrol students through faculties, through schools, and might have supervisors located within an academic teaching team. But because there hadn't been a program here for a couple of years within the centre, we had the benefit of sitting down and designing from scratch what would a program look like. We could just simply take on students, pair them up with advisors and say, off you go, or we could think about the type of scholarship that we want to be working on. And so at the heart of our programs is the Cultural Interface Scholarship after Nakata 2007. And the cultural interface really at the heart is about thinking about the knowledge spaces that we work within in Indigenous research, where Indigenous knowledge is present, but a lot of knowledge about Indigenous people, about Indigenous issues, about Indigenous knowledge itself has been reconfigured and reproduced as part of a corpus of knowledge written from a Western corpus. And so it's not as simple as working with Indigenous ideas or Western ideas, but really having to think about the layers in between. So we wanted to think about projects that are about the contemporary Indigenous position, that are about people's lives, that have the potential to affect Indigenous people's futures in a positive way, but thinking quite deeply around the different knowledge traditions and discourses that sit behind those. And so we've really worked together then to build a research community around this idea of scholarship, of interface scholarship. Doesn't mean that our students have to use any one particular framework when they come in, but we do ask them to, in the training we provide students, we really ask for them to think about those different layers in terms of how Indigenous knowledge works. And what we're really trying to do here is work towards the bigger national agenda around having a volume of graduates of Indigenous researchers who can go off and not just to fill up universities, but to produce research which has the potential to change people's lives. So really what we keep coming back to around the lunch table is we ask questions around what can we do with these types of knowledge outcomes and what types of projects can actually help communities to determine their own futures. So we've done this, as I indicated, through an MPhil and a PhD program. And throughout there, we've really looked at the idea of capacities as well. So one of the things that we did promise we would talk to you about today is the idea of capacities for supervisors as well as for students. So this will come out again in the conversation, but we did want to start with just highlighting a couple of the key ones. One of the first key capacities for supervisors is the need to be able to utilise frameworks that get at the intersection of Indigenous and Western knowledge systems. So again, there's different ways that people approach this across different disciplines. We do supervise in social science projects predominantly here at the IERC. But thinking about the different frameworks that supervisors can bring to a project, to a supervision team, to help a student make sense of what to do when they're working with Indigenous ideas in their research, when they're working with the corpus of Western knowledge as well that has been produced about Indigenous people, and having to negotiate those. So that's a really important one for supervisors. As part of our focus, as part of our practice, we've really looked at focusing on supervision as a way that we guide students through these complexities as well. So supervision remains a core aspect even when we do different group activities, but thinking as well in those everyday supervision meetings, how do we ask questions of the students to try to get them to go beyond the surface, try to get them to think about how different knowledge intersections are working in terms of their project and what that means for how they frame up their projects. And another thing that we look for supervisors in terms of their capacities is this need for creating spaces for Indigenous researchers to engage with both systems of knowledge. We sometimes get students come in saying, I just want to use Indigenous ideas in my research. Part of that is unpacking what is meant by an Indigenous idea, what sits behind that, but then also what is on offer and what can be most useful as a tool if the goal is to produce knowledge that is of use to community. And that's thinking the whole time as well there about how Indigenous agency sits within this. We talk to our students, to our Indigenous HDR students, that they have absolutely the capacity to move between different sets of ideas to make decisions about what's going to be most useful. So acknowledging that they're developing expertise there. And the other thing then on the other side of that is the types of capacities students need, and what it is that we're looking to focus on when working with the students. Firstly, this ability to critically analyse, but then also work with knowledge from both Indigenous and Western knowledge frameworks. So that's something that's a continual process of moving back and forth and asking questions about how do we understand this idea to have come about. It's important for our students to learn to sit within the academy. As we all know, it can at times be a challenging space to sit. There are a lot of demands on the students on their time. And how they are able to structure their own work so that they can continue to make progress, that they can learn to say no is a really big one as well to the different demands that are being put forward to them. But how they work within academic traditions at the same time as maintaining their responsibilities to communities. So working within academia doesn't mean that you've walked away or turned your back on family ties and community responsibilities there as well. So we're trying to really develop their sense of being true to themselves in academia. And then their confidence in engaging at the intersections. So knowing that their work doesn't always look like it's immediately applicable. Our students rarely produce theses or research outcomes that can just be picked up and applied and operationalized straight away, but rather trying to ask the big questions that can produce different types of understandings, which will have the ability to feed back into community. I'm already talking too much here, so it's about time to shift on. Yeah, I'm getting the nod. So just some tips, and we'll come back to these at the end, but just to highlight these, the things that we're looking for really, if there's a few takeaways for you today, this idea that we need to foster independence in students, that we as advisors need to come in there with cultural or an awareness of culture and context as well, whether it's with international students or Indigenous students, but that we are working with individuals and all of the beautiful complexity of their lives. And open communication is a really key one as well for working with students, whether that's the old timely feedback, but also building those relationships of trust so that we can keep pushing students and can keep asking big questions of them. So with that, I'm going to change gears a little bit and open up more to my colleagues here as well. I've got a series of questions for the two of you, and I will tag in as we go. The first question that I wanted to put, and perhaps to you, Prof. Sana, to start with, if you could share your thoughts on this, but what are some of the things you do when you're working with a student, perhaps fresh in their degree, to help identify a research problem? And what are some of the types of considerations you ask them to think about?
Thanks, Dr. Ailie. So my experience is supervising both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, and I've supervised across a range of disciplines. One of the key things I think for any student, particularly those who are working on Indigenous research topics, is that spend a lot of time really trying to shift their gears from more immediate kind of reactive advocacy type projects towards building a more intellectual life world. So you've set out from the beginning that we approach HDR space as really about capacity building for Indigenous self-determination and for the needs of communities, which is absolutely a world-changing project. But for students who come into the PhD, they're often motivated by very immediate desires to change particular problems that they've encountered in the world. And the PhD or an MPhil is really an opportunity for them to take a much bigger perspective. So trying to show them how the intellectual inquiries that we have a really special opportunity to do in higher degree research can assist and connect with those kinds of world-changing projects without the projects themselves being really focused on fixing things, really helps them to think about the scholarship that they want to contribute to. So I spend a lot of time, particularly in that first year, getting them to read really widely. And I probably have my students read much more widely than the typical supervisor. This reflects the Indigenous studies space. It's a field of study that is in conversation with just about every other discipline in the academy. And our students face a particular expectation that they understand where their work fits in that broader scholarly conversation. And until they have a good sense of that, until they have a good sense of how the intellectual project of higher degree research can fit into the world they live in, and also where that contribution is going to fit in the academic landscape, I find those two components really help to unlock their confidence and sense of ownership around the particular question and inquiry they want to pursue.
So for me, and I too have supervised both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students at the honours level, master's level, and PhD level to completion. So I speak from a much broader context than just about the supervision of an Indigenous student. So to the supervisors in the audience today, I would really try and emphasize research literature that actually explores that difficult intersection between Western and Indigenous knowledge traditions. These are very complex spaces, and guidance in that area is really important, and exposure to that kind of conversation and the discourses around those intersections are very important. And you don't have to just focus on Indigenous areas. The intersectionality is across many different areas, the queer spaces, the feminist areas, and so on. And to get them practice in reading a particular kind of narrative in the research game, that would really benefit their scholarship around the intersections. The second point I would raise would be for supervisors to get students to focus on the complexities of how you navigate those multiple traditions. It's not a very easy thing to do, but it's a very worthwhile project for them to explore and grow knowledge about those very difficult kind of conversations that we have to have in order to be able to progress the kind of innovations at the research level. Also encourage supervisors to share experiences in creating spaces amongst yourselves where Indigenous researchers can engage with both systems while advancing Indigenous agencies within the academy. And that is an element that's not often talked about, and it's something that I think we should really expose all our students to.
Thanks, Prof. I might tag into that one too, because I come in from a particular position that I started as part of this program as an ECR and got thrown in the deep end. I don't think I'm allowed to call myself an ECR anymore. I've aged out of that. but learning on the fly, but with the benefit, I suppose, of working within a program as an early career researcher. I wasn't left to myself, but rather having a structure around it. And so my approach has been very much influenced by the interface scholarship. I think I've seen over the years students coming in wanting to do projects, and they're very quick. It's a bit similar to the advocacy point that you raised there, Prof. Sana, but a little bit different. Students tend to be quite well tapped into the current discourses, I've noticed, of whatever the big hot topic is at the moment. And I suppose that comes in from their professional spaces as well. So education's gone through a big push with cultural competency, and students coming going, I want to do this project around cultural competency. This is what I think it can achieve. So it's been really a process for me of asking the students to unpack why and what is that concept and where does it come from, and even just working at the concept level of getting them to unpack the layers behind any idea. I've found a really useful starting point to get students going on their research projects, just to ask them what are the assumptions behind this idea. And that might lead us on then as well to the next question here around, once the students develop their project, how they're actually going to go about and do it. Because I also get a lot of students coming in saying, I've got my project and I'm going to interview these 35 people, usually from these 5 communities, and come in ready to go. There's a lot of keenness to get going, but also assumptions around the types of methodologies that they should use. And I know, speaking with other supervisors, but also I've seen it come through from examiners and reviewers, this assumption that Indigenous HDR students should be working with Indigenous research methodologies. And I just wanted to open that one up for conversation for your thoughts from the panel. Might go to you again, Prof. Sana, on this, because I know we've chatted about this.
Yeah, I was going to say go to Prof. Nakata first, but look, we could, and we do run multi-day workshops on just this stuff, right? So I'll try and be brief. I'll make 2 particular points, I think, and these particularly form how we approach the teaching of theory and method and methodology in our HDR intensives. The first is to say that we don't subscribe to a view that either Indigenous knowledge nor Western knowledge is methodologically monistic, right? Both involve multiple paradigms of knowledge, and following on from those diverse ontological, epistemological commitments, and following on from that, of course, methodological implications. So we teach our students that. We introduce all of our students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, to how to unpack and have a good command of knowledge traditions wherever they come from. The second, I think, that we really try to emphasize, and I think we see a lot of poor understanding of this across the academy generally, that Indigenous standpoint is a knowledge position. It's a position from which knowledge is produced at the cultural interface. It is not an identity position that inherently or automatically authorizes knowledge. And I've seen that collapsed in PhD theses that I've examined. It's something that I have to manage with a number of students that I've supervised, which is to say that before we get into things like Indigenous research practice, whether that's methods or methodology, we've got to take a big step back and make sure that our students are equipped to understand knowledge production. And in the intensive we ran just last week, we spent 2 full days on Western knowledge systems. But by the 3rd day, we were able to put to our students really key questions and debates that are currently animating the field of Indigenous research. Questions like, what's the difference between a yarning circle and a focus group? What would make one an Indigenous research practice, and where would it not meet that standard? And actually getting our HDR candidates to feel really confident about their own analysis of knowledge-making practices and methodological practices, that they can actually pass the debates that they're encountering in their research. And this goes, I think, to a real fundamental approach, which is that we're building their skills as researchers. We're not just teaching them how to apply a particular method, we're teaching them to understand how methods produce particular forms of knowledge. And my view is that Indigenous people do not live in a world without Western knowledge. Our standpoint is not a pure position that's cut off from the rest of the world. Our standpoint is located at the cultural interface where these knowledge systems meet, intersect, feed off each other, augment each other, transform. And our task as supervisors is to give our students in Indigenous research a command and an understanding of that.
Look, I'll just quickly add to that, just to say that these are very complex dimensions as the intersection between knowledge traditions occur in the contemporary space and even in history when we're explicating the past. And we need very rigorous kind of methodological frameworks to do that. And yes, we're all wedded to the sanctity and importance of Indigenous methodologies. But there's some of those methodologies are not able to kind of deal with the complexities that we're talking about. And we've been blessed by some of the Western scholarship that have actually looked at these intersections, not just with studies of women, but also studies of diaspora communities, of migrants. There are a whole richness in intellectual approaches to the complexities that we are talking about. And our guidance for you going forward is to be ensuring that students are encouraged towards frameworks and approaches that are much more appropriate for the actual topics. And I think that's a really important one to take away from today's session.
Thank you, Prof. I might leave that question there and move on to the next one. What is the role of non-Indigenous advisors in working with Indigenous students? And I added this one in because, again, it's a topic that comes up a lot of the time. We get students coming to us often from other faculties here at JCU wanting to have an Indigenous advisor on their panel, which we unfortunately don't have the luxury of having a big enough staff that we can go and use supervisors from the IERC on panels all across the university. But it is something that comes up in a lot of different spaces. And if I could, I might take the lead on this one first. I can speak from the position of being the non-Indigenous advisor sitting on panels of Indigenous students and of non-Indigenous students working with Indigenous research projects. And I'll probably start by saying that I recognise I sit in a very particular position here. I'm lucky enough to work within an Indigenous centre with some very strong Indigenous leadership between Prof Nakata, Associate Prof Nakata, Prof Cadet James and Associate Professor Watkin-Louis, who's not here today. She wasn't able to come and sends her apologies. I've got a lot of touch points that I can go to, and I'm really embedded in a discourse around Indigenous self-determination and a lot of the more theoretical discussions around how to do this work as well. So I recognise that some of my non-Indigenous colleagues across the country may not be as lucky to have as stronger basis to go from. But I think for me, it's really been a case of doing my work, doing my reading, making sure I'm developing my own expertise, and again, benefit of a continual lunchtime conversation, but making sure that I'm still connecting in with those broader discourses that are led by Indigenous researchers and by Indigenous leadership. And then if I can tag back into something that Prof Sana said just before around Indigenous standpoint, I've seen this used as well by Indigenous students. So I've had to learn as a supervisor when an Indigenous student comes and says, I'd like to use Indigenous standpoint theory. I know how to do this and I just need everybody else to listen to me, is one case that I had of an education student, and having to work with that student to go through the process of what does an Indigenous standpoint mean in terms of being an informed position that's perhaps a position that's informed by her experience as an Indigenous teacher in school systems, but is not in itself a research finding, is not in itself an outcome. But how can she use that to ask different questions? So I think that's been, for me, to develop my confidence, as well as always keeping in the big conversation and going to my colleagues and saying, what about this? I'm not sure about this. But then working with the students to make sure that they're asking questions of themselves and their research. And that took some courage. At the start, I think I was probably a bit more like, oh yeah, oh, who am I to tell this student that that's not enough? And very quickly I learned it wasn't sufficient. I couldn't just have a student write down their experience of something. So I'll open that up for responses from my bosses here.
I might go with three key points, I think, for supervisors who are present today. I would encourage you all to approach supervision with humility, understanding your roles as facilitators in these very difficult engagements across the knowledge traditions. I would also stress the importance of learning from Indigenous students whilst supporting their academic journey through an engaging process, one that can have room for them to articulate very new and difficult areas that we need to progress. And the third point I would make is really to work with scholars and mentors, Indigenous scholars and mentors around you, as Dr. Hayes mentioned, to ensure that your engagement is both sensitive and responsive to the kind of needs that we see of students having to tackle some of these very difficult dimensions.
Did you want to?
I don't have anything to add, Dr. Ailie. I mean, I think you're an excellent example of what it means to be a non-Indigenous supervisor who approaches their work with humility, and what it means to learn from students and to draw on your Indigenous colleagues for that. I could offer one reflection is that my experience of being brought onto existing research teams when an Indigenous student is perhaps requiring some additional support is often that I'm brought in to fill in what supervisors perceive as their gap in expertise or knowledge to support the student. And often that gap is around non-Indigenous supervisors, lack of understanding of the interface between and across Western and Indigenous knowledge systems. And one of my frustrations has been that as a supervisor, you have a responsibility to understand the field that the students are working in. And so I think being willing to put the time in to understand that, if you're working with Indigenous students, as Prof Nakata has described, is essential. And it's not different from me as an Indigenous researcher working on a quantitative sociology PhD project as a co-supervisor, having to upskill my understanding of quantitative research methods. It's good supervision practice. And if you're supervising Indigenous research projects, you have to have a command and understanding of Indigenous and Western knowledge systems.
Thank you. So I'm going to take us to our final question now, which is what happens after the fact. What are some of the types of things you keep in mind with your students when you're thinking about examination or any other type of peer review, perhaps the students putting their first journal article forward? Prof Nakata, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would advocate for examinations that have examiners who understand these difficult intersections, and particularly would warn against getting examiners who don't understand this, because they will inevitably draw assessment standpoints from their old traditions. And the other point I think I would make would to urge in particularly peer review processes to assess the work based on how well it engages with and contributes to both the Indigenous and Western systems of knowledge production, and look for those kind of elements that might enrich our intellectual discourse going forward. And the final point I would make would be to highlight the need for flexibility in applying Western standards and allowing for research that really is centered around different kinds of epistemological standpoints, and perhaps to be cautious about the kind of measures we would take to those as well.
Yeah, I would echo those, Dr. Ailie. It's not always an easy thing to do. We have still a small but growing pool of academic scholars here and around the world who are really well equipped in this space. Within particular disciplines, I would always be looking for examiners that are more methodologically plural in their practice or open-minded in their work, rather than those who perhaps are very fixed in their approach or are part of very interior conversations within their disciplines. I think that's all I would add on that. I mean, the other thing that I think as supervisors we're doing for students working in this space is that we have to arm our students earlier about when to defend their work. So growing our MPhil and PhD students quite quickly to be secure in the questions they are asking, the methodologies that they're adopting, and the types of knowledge that that produces, so that when these weaker reviews, and they do come in, and Dr. Ailie, you've just had a recent experience of this, you know, it's almost like you tick the box. Where's your paragraph on Indigenous data sovereignty? Why aren't you using an Indigenous research method? That really we need to equip our students quite early to know how to answer those questions rather than to yield to those requests.
Yeah, thank you. I think just to bring that in together with some of the different themes that have come up before we move to Q&A, if I can just take a minute to, I suppose, summarise 2 key takeaways here. One that I've really heard from this conversation is the need for us as a field of advisors and a community of advisory practice to really develop capacities to work between knowledge systems. That's been emphasised in different ways in terms of needing advisors to do their reading in the field and to really come across these debates, in terms of needing to develop the capacities to share those with students. But that's been a really big pickup for me. And then just to follow on from that, this idea as well of fostering independence of students is, you said earlier, Prof. Sana, passing debates that they may encounter in the research. And I think that's really key, that when students are working in a field where there is, as you say, a growing but not yet very big pool of examiners who can work across knowledge systems, that we need to work with students so that they can understand not just their own research project, but how their project sits within a bigger knowledge framework and a bigger endeavour of Indigenous research projects that are there to try to advance Indigenous agency. So just bringing it back to these 3 key points from before, I think it really is about fostering independence for the students. One of the ways we've been trying to do that is by setting up the structures so they can understand the knowledge frameworks that they're working in. But then as supervisors, we're coming in with an awareness to make sure that we're, as Prof. Nakata said, being humble, thinking about where the student's coming from, what they're bringing to it, and trying to work out how do we guide and facilitate their learning. And a lot of that comes through open communication. We've just added here as well, Tracy very kindly put the link to the book chapter in the chat before, but here's a QR code if that's anybody's preferred way of finding materials. Again, it's a pretty easy read. It's about 3,000 words and very practically written. It's really about trying to span a research degree and the types of questions that might come up. But at this point, we'd love to turn to yourselves and to hear any questions. Prof. Cadet James, I know you're probably sick of us throwing you in the deep end on all these things, but I'd love to hear your responses first, and then we might open up to the floor.
We might take down the top tips.
Yeah. Are you just on mute there, Prof?
Sorry. So thank you very much, and thanks for the presentation, and congratulations on the ongoing work and also the publication of the book. So I think this all just continually adds to the evidence base, if you like, around Indigenous research. Totally agree and support everything that's been said. And as you know, we're all on the same page. We all come from the same position. We all worked together for many years. Probably 2 points I'd like to reinforce, and that's really about students being well read in a number of disciplines and making sure that they read broadly, as Prof. Nakata said before, and not just being able to have that breadth of understanding from all the different areas they might explore, but really having the skills to analyse that for what it means generally, but certainly what it means in terms of their work and how that actually informs what they're doing. And secondly, certainly support intersection. Students need to have that understanding of that intersection between Western knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge systems. And I have been concerned for a little while that Western knowledge systems seem to become this monster that we need to avoid. In actual fact, if we don't have an understanding of the Western knowledge systems as well as Indigenous knowledge systems, and very importantly, that intersection that you all spoke about before, then it's very difficult to come to a place where you're feeling very confident and also well-researched, well-versed in your research topic and where it might, and the direction it might be headed. In terms of supervision, I totally agree that I have been part of many panels, and as an Indigenous researcher, you're asked to fill that gap. But totally support what Prof. Sanders said before, that if you're going to be supervising Indigenous students with an Indigenous topic, then you really need to have that understanding. So it doesn't mean to say you just concentrate on the other aspects of the research and call in somebody to fill that gap. Basically, there's a responsibility on the supervisor to have that broader understanding. Thank you.
Well, we'll come to the point where it's over to you for the questions you may like to ask, or comments that you might like to offer, or some wisdom about your experiences in supervising both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students with Indigenous topics.
There's a question in the chat. We could start with that one if I read it out, which is, do we find that Indigenous students do often bring knowledge to it? My experience has been that they often have very limited cultural knowledge and are partly or largely looking to the HDR experience to expand their knowledge. How do we help them on this journey? I can take a first go at it. I mean, I think one of the challenges when you have new HDR students who don't yet have a strong foundation in theories of knowledge, to take a kind of broad characterization of it, is that this is exactly where we end up. So there is this idea that there is Indigenous knowledge, it's traditional, it's cultural, it is largely understood in terms of how it is different from Western knowledge, particularly where it's coming from candidates who aren't necessarily grounded or connected in their the knowledge practices of their local communities, or haven't grown up with direct access to Indigenous knowledge, and Western knowledge, which is everything else. And so when you equip students to understand that there is a relationship between Indigenous and Indigenous and Western knowledge, that they have worked to co-constitute one another in the history of the Western tradition, that has then produced Indigenous peoples in a particular way, you can actually have a conversation with your students that really upends it, and they find themselves equipped with new kinds of positions to work from. And that's certainly what informs the design of our HDR training, you know, and really getting students to understand that there are particular definitions and characteristics that we ascribe to knowledge practices that occurs within the Western tradition. One of the things we do really early on is talk about the ontological turn between the theological foundation of knowledge and a more humanist foundation of knowledge in the Enlightenment. And we get them to reflect on how Indigenous knowledge has been historically studied as spiritual in nature. And we get them to really unpack, like, what's the knowledge claims being made here? And so this is then not about accessing cultural knowledge. It's about understanding what constitutes Indigenous knowledge, what constitutes Western knowledge, how they're related to one another, and then how we understand key differences and distinctions, particularly at the ontological level.
And thanks, Gil, for that question. That's always a very difficult one to answer. But I would also say that Indigenous students bring a lot of knowledge to the space. what's often not understood is where Indigenous knowledge begins and ends, and Western knowledge begins and ends. And that is the difficult kind of intersection we've been trying to raise today for your awareness that students will need a hand with, as well as supervisors, to navigate those very, very complex kind of intersections that have happened over the last couple of 100 years. So it's very, very difficult these days for anyone to take a position on that. And so this is a new ground. And as you know, as researchers, new ground is also grounds for innovation. So I encourage you to take the step towards the difficult challenges that are ahead of us. Jacinta.
Hi, everyone. This has been so valuable, so thank you so much for this workshop today. I really appreciate it. I'm a Jawa Yarrawu scholar who's just finished a PhD at Monash Uni, so my goodness, thank God for that.
Fun.
But I just want to speak to that question, which is a really important one about the cultural knowledge that students bring. And from my experience, I'm the 4th generation removed, and mine was a stolen generation story. So my storytelling is connected to the stories of many families who have that experience of removal from country, both physical and that psychological removal through things like exemption policy and things like that, which all these policies that have told Aboriginal people not to practice, not to speak language, not to do this and that, but also not to believe in their own rights to cultural knowledges, and not to believe or remember. They've been taught to forget or be told that they have lost their knowledges, when in fact they haven't lost them. They're being taught to forget. And so we go through this, from my experience, you know, I'm 50, so I did the PhD when I was 46. So as I'm doing all of this research and reading about Indigenous and non-Indigenous methodologies, often when I was reading Indigenous methodology, what I was doing was reading this material and remembering, my God, that is so familiar to me. So you're reading the theory and then you're starting to remember, and you have these embodied memories all coming to the surface, which is it's quite an amazing, incredible experience. But importantly, I had an Indigenous supervisor and a non-Indigenous supervisor, and both were very skilled at allowing me the time to go through that process, which was also an emotional process. So you have PhD students that there is so much going on inside of your head and your heart, which you maybe are sharing that with your supervisors, maybe you're not. But I can promise everybody that there is a lot going on inside of a student's body when they are picking up on learning about doing this vast reading, which I completely agree must be done, because it puts your feet on the ground and it keeps your work, you know, entirely rigorous. But it is an emotional experience because you are remembering all of these things that your family through generations has been told to forget, or you've been, you know, removed from. So I think that is a really important question, and it's a very important role of the supervisor to support the student through that process, and have that open communication so that the student feels safe enough to talk about this really complex stuff that's going inside of your head. Because many of us are mature age students too. We have these lives and then we have this amazing opportunity to go back to study. So many of us are doing this as mature age students.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really good experience, and really can't wait to get you on board as a supervisor, because there's lots of work out there for all of us, and for helping our non-Indigenous allies as well through these very difficult situations. Stacey has got her hand up.
Hi everyone, and thanks everyone for an amazing session. I'm Stacey Taylor. I'm a non-Indigenous supervisor of 2 wonderful Indigenous candidates at RMIT in Melbourne. I'm fortunate enough to have an Indigenous scholar on the team of one of them, and the session has reminded me not to lean on her too heavily for for that perceived knowledge gap. And sometimes it's as much about confidence as anything else. On the other team, we're both non-Indigenous supervisors, and the question I have, and apologies in advance for the possibly stupid question, but I trust that there are no stupid questions, is that this candidate in particular takes very seriously the responsibility to community, to the point that she sometimes gets in her own way, to the point that her desire to be, in her words, the model Indigenous academic gets in the way of the messy business of, she's in her first year too, reading widely, you know, finding yourself in cul-de-sacs and finding your way out, etc. So I just wondered if anyone had had that experience, or any insights into navigating the tricky business of, yes, of course, there's a responsibility to community, which, by the way, is an extra pressure and not something that my Western candidates have to think about as much. And also just letting yourself have this as your time for your research.
Dr. Ailie, you'll be good on that one, I think.
Yeah, but I saw you responding as well. I think one of the things I think about there is that a lot of the HDR students who come in, Indigenous HDR students, are used to being leaders, are used to holding roles of responsibility. As much as possible, creating space to say this is your time to be a student, because they're also battling with imposter syndrome the whole time, and it doesn't feel good when you're used to being the person with a lot of answers and the person who people come to then reverse positions and now be in the learning space. I think easing that transition and giving people a framework. One of the students I spoke to in a research project explicitly had problems with this, as somebody who was used to being a high-level professional and did not like being the student. So I think any types of frameworks around setting up, but making them feel comfortable in terms of asking questions and the collegiality then, and sharing that you're learning as well from that, but that this is their time to learn and to be okay. And that's part of the longer journey. Prof. Sana, did you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, I think it's a tricky space. You know, my PhD is in politics. I've supervised lots of non-Indigenous students in politics, and, you know, non-Indigenous students, their motivation for wanting to work with community or in kind of advocacy and activist spaces is really common. You're right, the kind of sense of responsibility and duties that Indigenous students have to community, sometimes those are quite required roles and responsibilities within their community membership, is different, and you know, having a respect and taking your time to learn and understand that is important. But it's also not unique to Indigenous students, and it is just a part about drawing on our experience as supervisors to help students to make those judgments and develop their independence in making those judgments over time, because when they become academics, those pressures don't change, right? Your doctorate's conferred, but you still have those relationships and duties. So to then be able to stand on your own feet in what is a challenging career, the role of my supervision is really to make sure by the time I get my students to the end of their candidature, is that they feel better equipped to do that. A small practice I have with students, but also with staff that I mentor and supervise, is I say, if you need me to be the one to say no, I'll say it. You know, and giving them, you know, there'll be people in the room who have the templates I've written about how to say no in respectful ways. So sometimes they're just looking for permission to say no, a little bit of backup. But the other side of it is, you know, really respecting what those demands are, and really making your candidates feel empowered to take ownership of their choices.
Thanks. Thank you all for this afternoon. We're almost on the hour, and I might just use a couple of minutes just to say that we are developing workshops in this area for supervisors, so that we can spend a lot more time drilling down into the very, very difficult supervision issues. And I think that's the only way really to get on top of this, and where we can discuss very particular cases and particular situations that could help you transition through that process, but importantly to transition the students through that process as well. And if you do come along to this workshop, please bring your knowledge as well of non-Indigenous students who are challenged with difficult topics as well, because they're often the same. You know, there's a whole lot of personal determination and will of students that comes through in no matter what your background. There's also this kind of position about, I know everything about the world, I just need the degree. And so there's all of that stuff too. But we can have fun with this stuff because, you know, you need to be a bit more upbeat about the going into the space, because it is a difficult space. And I might go to Stephen Mukey here, because he I know has supervised students from way out, and maybe if we go to him for some closing words here, Stephen, because Stephen's been around a long time. I remember when I first met him, dinosaurs were running around then, and so he's got lots of experiences here. But we look forward to working with you all in the future at some point, where we can help each other to get by these challenging times. Stephen.
Well, thanks, Martin. I'm joining you from Ghana, Ghana country, the Adelaide Plains, but I work at the Nulungu Research Institute in Broome, where half of the population is Indigenous, and also half of the staff at Nulungu are Indigenous. So it's a situation that I think is pretty interesting. I thought the session today was really good. So much has changed since our day, Martin. So many disciplines have come online. You know, cultural astronomy, Indigenous sciences are coming up. There's a whole spread of disciplines that are, you know, exciting work to be done. But I've got a tricky little question to finish on. We often refer to the elders in the West Kimberley. We refer to them, we defer to them, but we don't know how to recognise their qualifications. Do they have to come to the university and get MAs, or would there be a way of one day, or maybe it's already happening, giving you know, committee of elders gives upcoming elders a qualification that recognises their knowledge?
It's a really, really good point. And you know, thousands and thousands of years have been passing through, and the senior members of our community do still hold the elements and the residue of that tradition, and it's still practiced today in different forms. But they carry a lot of responsibility of keeping that connection alive. And at some point, we really have to get serious about the recognition process. Folks, Tracy, where are you? We're on the hour, 1 minute after the hour. I did promise us we'd complete on the hour. Very, very great to meet you all. I hope you have a great afternoon, whatever's left of it, and good luck with your supervision of these students. It is worthwhile, and I think the new grounds for the innovation, in particular in social science, is going to happen in this space. So I encourage you all to be brave, be courageous, and do well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
On behalf of ACGR, can I just extend our warmest thanks to Professor Nakata, Associate Professor Sana Nakata, and to Dr Ailie McDowall for a wonderful, wonderful and insightful session. I think everyone's walking away from here having a deeper understanding of some of the issues that we need to work through to support our Indigenous HDR candidates. And on behalf of ACGR, we also look forward to supporting the IERC in your work and anything that we can do to help spread the word. We're here for it. So thank you all very much. Thank you again, and enjoy your afternoon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.